Okay, everyone, welcome back. Coming towards the end of our time together. It's been such a beautiful day, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this session with you around the idea of the red thread. I'm going to invite you to turn your camera on if you can. I would really love to see you. We're going to be going through a bit of a journey together in the next 45 minutes. So it would be beautiful if we can share our faces with one another, not just with me, but with each other. So if you're able to be camera on, I truly appreciate that. I'm also going to invite you to get a pen and paper. So if you are able to grab yourself a journal and a pen, or a pen and paper. You could even type if that works better for you, but something where you can write stuff down. I'm pretty sure that everybody knows me in this space by now, but my name is Katie Rose. I am a doula. I am a prenatal yoga teacher. I'm a mother of 5. I have been working in this space of childbirth, pre and postnatal care for, gosh, more than 20 years now, a long time. And it's something I'm really passionate about, as you'll see, and hopefully as you have seen already today throughout the summit. So I'd love to ask you to just close down your eyes for a moment and take a couple of deep breaths. Relax your jaw. Maybe even just move your body around a little bit, especially if you've been with us all day, a lot of screen time. So just a little bit of a sway or a shoulder release or some kind of reinvigoration for a moment. Again, those of you just joining us, the invitation to join with camera on would be so deeply appreciated by me, if you can. Okay, and then gently closing down your eyes, just taking a moment to reflect on this question. What do you know about your own birth? About how you came into this world? What do you know about your own birth? Probably most likely what your mother has told you. So when you've had a few threads or thoughts or ideas land, just gently opening your eyes and taking a few notes in your journal, on your notebook. What do you know about your own birth? The moment, the day that you came earthside through the portal of birthing. What do you know about your own birth? And now the next question is a little stretching out of that first question. What do you know about the way that your grandmother birthed your mother? So your matriarchal grandmother, your grandmother on your mother's side. What do you know, if anything at all, and you may not know anything about this, about how your grandmother birthed your mother? And if you don't know anything about it, that in itself is kind of interesting. There's something to reflect on in the not knowing as well as in the knowing. Anything that anyone would like to share? Anyone willing to share what they know about their own birth or what they know about their mother's birth? Feel free to unmute yourself. I'd love to hear.
I'm happy to share.
Thank you.
I know about my own birth because I was one of four. My mom had four C-section, and it was a planned C-section. And my mom always referred that it was too early, so it was to suit the object going on holiday. So I'm a July baby, so in France, it's the summer holiday. And she said I was not ready for it, and I started breathing too early. So she didn't really see me. I went into the NICU directly. She didn't even know if I was alive. And it was at the time, the first birth out of the four that my dad attended. And so they both left pretty traumatized by this birth. And so it's been, I know about her birth, but I actually don't know about, I know about my birth, sorry, but I don't know about her birth. And I have been meaning to ask since the last Bhakti Club session, but I haven't yet. But I would really love to understand, especially because my mom is always telling me that there are some fears sometimes that I have today that she really say you need to do rebirthing, because I'm sure that this is linked to your birth, to the fact that you've been taken out when you were not ready. Well, yes. So yeah, it's
Thank you. Thank you for
thank
sharing.
you.
Taken out when you weren't ready so the obstetrician could go on holiday. I mean, I'm laughing and I'm not laughing all at the same time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Anyone else like to share? Does anyone know very much about their mother's birth? Does anyone have the grandmother story? No, that your own birth. Most of us have something around our own birth, and no one knows about how their mother was born. Isn't that interesting? It's so interesting to me. Anyone else like to share about their own birth? So Lily's saying that she was a water birth at home on her sister's 6th birthday. Beautiful. So you have the same birthday as your sister, right? That's so lovely. Gemma, mum's water broke 2 months early. They told her she had to transfer, and they were going to try and push the baby's head back in. Wow. Gosh. The doctor was very rude to her and told her to keep quiet when birthing you, and that her husband wouldn't appreciate it if she didn't get her vaginal tear stitched up. Woof, that's a big story. That's a lot. Yeah, totally understand that you're at work and you probably don't want all your colleagues to hear that story.
I can just share a little bit of what I do know.
Yes.
I don't know sort of a lot of details, but basically whenever I ask my mum, she gets very triggered. She doesn't like to talk about it, which says something in itself. So I wouldn't dare ask her about her birth. But I know that about 2 days after I was born 3 days before Christmas, and they induced me so I wouldn't come on Christmas. And then a couple of days after I was born, she left the hospital to go to a Christmas party, and then she had a christening planned for me already. So I think when she discharged from hospital 6 days after I was born, she went straight off to my christening. So I had a christening before I even went home. There you go.
Wow. So another birthing story that's kind of organized around dates and plans that people have scheduled in advance.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else feel called to share?
I believe with my mum, for my nan, with her birthing, it was kind of quite like old tribal base. Like they lived in the bush in tents, and I think it was like a birth in that community kind of thing. Whereas I was born in a hospital. I think mum got stitches and stuff, but I was kind of pretty easy apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was kind of a nice thing to sort of identify that my mum with my sister, she started droving at 11 years of age. And she was only like 15 or something when she had my sister. And she was born out back Queensland somewhere. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Not always, but sometimes when we go back a little bit further, when we go back to the grandmothers or the grandmothers, even if we can have the opportunity to go that far back, we can learn about birthing that is a little bit more in the environment of family and less in the medical institutions, depending on how old you are as well. So there can be some interesting reflections there around sort of like the community and the element of non-intervention, because intervention hadn't yet become so mainstream. For some of us, that might mean going back 3 generations. But it's interesting how certainly if we go back one generation, there's a lot of stories of the trauma and the, you know, what suited people other than the woman giving birth to her baby is a very, very common thread. I want to ask you one more question around the journaling element. So I'd love for you to think now back to the first time you had a menstrual cycle, the first time you had your moon cycle, the first time you noticed blood in your underwear. What did that feel like? What stories do you know around that time? Did you know what was happening? Did you understand? What was the feeling tone around that first menstrual cycle? Maybe you don't remember it very well. And again, that there's clues in that as well. And then I might just invite you to share in the chat, those of you who feel called, just share in the chat some of the words that came out of that experience, your first moon cycle, some words around your experience of that. So Erin's saying isolated, her mother was away, she was confused, she felt abandoned. Gemma was away at school. She thought it was her period, but she couldn't contact her mum, talked to her roommate, and then she showed me how to put a pad on. Don't really remember. Mum said I was excited. My mum said she thought she was dying when she got hers, which is really common for, again, that older generation when there wasn't much conversation around it. A lot of women thought that something was wrong because suddenly you're bleeding. Danny doesn't remember. Bianca, I was about 14. I remember telling my mum in the morning and she gave me the day off school. We ate chocolate and waxed our legs. Beautiful. I love that. Edwina was excited. She was the last of her friends. Me too. I was very late. And I remember thinking, gosh, I really hope this happens soon because I feel like a weirdo. Everyone was excited in her house. Beautiful. Mariam wasn't so well. Yeah. And her mum wasn't home. So there's a noticing here that the mum being around is important, right? A few of you are speaking about how your mother wasn't there and that there's a feeling of like somehow that's significant or important. You wanted your mum to be around. And those of you that do remember it, remember your mum being there and how your mum responded. Very interesting. We notice the presence of the mother figure or the absence, and there's some feeling around that. It seems significant that our mothers are around to witness this rite of passage. Kerry got hers as a Christmas present. Beautiful and really supportive mum for Diane. So lovely. Lack of communication. Yeah, so a whole mixed bag. But what's significant and interesting, or the thread I'm going to pick up on there, is this idea of the role of your own mother in that experience, whether through absence or presence. It seems to come up a lot. So in the journaling prompts that I've just asked you to reflect on and to make notes on, what I'm attempting to do is give you a little bit of a taste of, or a feeling for, some of the red threads that move through our lives. Now, the red thread is a symbol, or an idea, or a paradigm, or a template that describes how different events in our lives are connected around our experience of being a woman. So it doesn't necessarily relate to whether or not you've had children, or whether you're going to have children, or whether you're pregnant, or any of those elements. It relates to your lived and embodied experience in a female body. This is the red thread. In fact, it really is around your physiology, your physicality, but also your identity, and your sense of connection to self, and sense of self-esteem, and how you see your body, the relationship you have with your body. These red threads come and go, and they change, and like a thread, they weave in and out of each other. So what we're able to do in the practice of red thread work, in the practice of this kind of reflection, is tease out certain threads and look at them for clues around what's happening in our lives and how we're experiencing being a woman at any particular moment. And usually where the red thread work becomes particularly helpful or potent is when we are in a transition, when something is like a rite of passage or a significant event in the journey of womanhood is happening. So birth is the very first one, of course. And then for most women, it will be first menstrual cycle. It could be if there has been some kind of sexual violation or sexual experience prior to first menstrual cycle. That might also be part of the red thread too. Red thread contains both our hurts and our joys and celebrations. So red thread can be seeped in trauma and seeped in hurt, but it can also be seeped in joy and resilience and capacity and celebration. So it doesn't in and of itself have any flavor. We bring to the red thread the flavor that we impart. And this is particularly interesting, I think, and relevant, because what red thread work allows us to do is reframe the way that we look at things in our lives. So there's a beautiful opportunity here to take the stories and the narratives that we may have lived by for a very long time, and to examine them and to look at them through different perception, and to literally create a reframe. And I want to give you a couple of examples, but before I do, as well as our own embodied experiences, which form the red threads of who we are, particularly going back through our matriarchal line, but also to a certain extent our patriarchal line as well, meaning the line of our father and our grandmother on that side. We're also under the influence of three really significant factors in the journey of the red thread at this particular time in history. And those three factors are capitalism, colonialism, and the patriarchy. So let me explain a little bit how those three things impact our red thread stories. And this is true for any woman birthing in the world at this time. So the first is capitalism, which basically means that money on some level is going to be involved in your red thread story. In the example of a woman who is forced, or not forced, but who is strongly encouraged to have an early cesarean so that the obstetrician can go on holiday, there's a power dynamic that's happening there that has to do with, someone having power over and having a senior authoritarian position, again, often linked to money. in many birthing spaces, women who perhaps don't have as much information or knowledge as would be of service to them assume that they will get better or the best healthcare if they pay more money. So I remember when I was pregnant with my last child, my 5th baby, my partner, who wanted the best for me and wanted the best for our baby, said to me straight away, just book the best obstetrician, find the best obstetrician, doesn't matter how much it costs, and book in with that person. Because in his mind, the more you pay, the better you get, right? And so then I went through a journey of education with him in explaining that actually that was exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do, and that in the birthing arena, in my opinion and my experience, paying more doesn't necessarily mean having a better experience. In fact, often quite the opposite. Hospital system is under budget constraints. It's working within a paradigm that is connected to our economy and to how much money is available. You know, from Jodie's session earlier on today, we could clearly see how much of an impact socioeconomic, financial situations, and area, you know, the postcode lottery, all of these things impact the type of birth that you might have. So that's the capitalism piece. Colonialism again taps into this idea of power over. So any society where there is a hierarchical element, where there is some people who have privilege and others who are underneath that privilege, will have an impact to the red thread of the women within those communities. So a very simple and very obvious example in Australia is that Indigenous people have much poorer birthing outcomes and birthing care support than non-Indigenous people in this country. That's a very obvious example, but colonialism also has a flavor to it that is very much engaged with the power dynamics. I mean, I have my own story. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but my own mother was born in India. So she, my grandparents were expats. My grandfather was a stockbroker, and they lived as expats, wealthy expats in colonial India. So there's already, you know, they had maids and servants and lived in a big house that was kept for them by Indian people, and they were both white. And when my grandmother birthed my mother, my grandmother looked like Marilyn Monroe. So you can imagine the imagery, right? She was this very wealthy, very beautiful model type colonial expat woman living in wealth in India. She birthed my mother and was basically disgusted by the whole process because it was kind of unsavory and not very delicate. And so my mother was taken away, and my mother was actually breastfed by an Indian wet nurse. So she received the breast milk of, you know, breastfeeding was outsourced, basically. Now, if that's not a story about colonialism, I don't know what is. And I have a picture, which is one of the defining images in my mind when I think about the red thread. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I've become so interested in this work, which is it's a black and white photo. It's taken in 1950, which is when the year my mother was born. My grandmother is reclining on a sun lounger in a bikini in the back garden of their home in India, and a woman, a very dark-skinned woman in a white sari, is sitting next to her. My grandmother's got a cigarette on a long filter. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Honestly, it's like incredible. With a bikini on, long filter cigarette, lounging around on a sun lounger, whilst the beautiful Indian woman in her white sari is holding my mother in her arm and breastfeeding her. This is where the red thread journey became so fascinating to me. That's colonialism, that's power over, that's it would definitely take us more than this session to unpack what's going on there in terms of the energetic dynamics, but that's a very extreme example. There are very, very many less extreme examples of how that can show up in our world, and not just colonialism, but I would say racial profiling in general. You know, that's a sort of watered down experience of the colonial experience. Power over, where one group of people has power over another group. It could also be, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a colonial way, but it could be in something like the caste system, for example, in India, like social hierarchy and structures. And then finally, patriarchy, which is so obvious. Patriarchy is where men, the male dominated elements of our world are in the arena of birthing and having more power than the birthing women themselves. So any example of a woman feeling like she hasn't been well communicated with, like she hasn't been respected, like she isn't well informed about what's happening, these are all examples often of the patriarchy in action. So now the good news is, and I really do believe this to be true, all three of those elements are getting better. We're getting more educated. We're understanding this, even if we don't understand the language of red thread, we're understanding these patterns of control and money and power over that are woven through our lives. And there's a greater call to action in terms of reversing the damage that those things have done. And then what we can do is we can take those bigger picture elements and we can actually apply them to our own personal lived experience. And we can say, well, how does this red thread show up in my life? Like, how does this show up in my experience of my first menstrual cycle or my experience of my own birth? And then the red thread progresses through into further life events, for example, our first sexual experiences. So the first time that you had or thought about yourself as a sexual being, as a woman, when you lost your virginity, what does it mean to give consent? What is consent really? And that's a very nuanced and subtle conversation when we really start digging into it, because often yes doesn't really mean yes. And so those questions and those reflections are all part of honoring the red thread, and it weaves through our experience. And so what then happens is that collectively and individually as women, we bring these narratives, we bring all these stories into the birthing space, and we often bring them into the birthing space unexamined. We haven't done the work of looking at, what does this mean for me in my life? When I asked my mother about my own birth, she said that she had not planned to have an epidural, but she was laboring with me. She had a beautiful midwife supporting her. My father wasn't there, as was the custom in the late 70s. And she was doing really well and like on track to birth vaginally and naturally. And then an obstetrician came into the room to check on her and said, oh, why don't we just pop an epidural in for you and get rid of the pain? And in that moment, even though she wouldn't have asked for an epidural, she decided, okay, yeah, sure, make it go away, and ended up having an epidural, which was actually quite unusual in the late 70s. So I think there's some elements of that story that are interesting to me as well. These things, I feel like for myself, like to pick up on that particular story of the red thread, then what has happened in my lived experience is that often I'm extra cynical and extra cautious that someone's trying to get one over on me, particularly a man. So the way that story, that red thread has shown up for me, it's like, what's your agenda here? Why do you really want to do this? Like, it's not really in service of me. There's something else going on here that you're there's another narrative that I'm not seeing. So a little bit of suspicion. And I think that tendency in me is part of the red thread of my own personal birthing experience. Really in this session, because we have such limited time, what I'm wanting to do is introduce you to the idea that the red thread exists and that it weaves through your lived experience, and that it's a combination of your own experiences, your own life experiences, which are completely unique to you, your ancestry and the stories of your mother and your grandmother and the people around you at the time of birth, and these big key factors of capitalism, colonialism, and the patriarchy, and how they also impact and feed into our own personal narratives and stories. And so my hope in this session is to just give you the idea that this exists, and the beginnings of the process of starting to look at your own red threads and how they might connect. One one thing that's really important in doing this red thread work is that you really keep in mind that there is no blame and there's no shaming. It's not about like, oh, this person's bad and this person's good, or this terrible thing happened and this amazing thing happened. It's really about a personal journey of discovery. It's about a personal exploration. And the thing is that we can see things in such multifaceted ways. And this is what we're good at as women. You know, we're not, the masculine energy is very linear and it tells the story, and it's a one track story of A to B. And I'm not talking about men, women necessarily. I'm talking now more masculine, feminine. The feminine, it's like a disco ball. You know, you move the disco ball around and it refracts in different ways and you see things from completely different perspectives. So when I think of that story of my grandmother on the sun lounger with her cigarette and her bikini, I can imagine what it was like to be my grandmother then. And actually the backstory of that is that she was born into poverty and pulled herself into wealth, and she wasn't going to give that up for anyone. She was going to bloody well lie on that sun lounger with a cigarette in her hand, because she had scraped her way out of abject poverty into this wealthy environment, and she wasn't going to let a baby bring her down. I mean, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that as a sentiment, but I understand it. And so that's one element of the mirror ball. And then we can only imagine what the wet nurse, what her story was or what her background was. You know, like there is no, this person's the hero and this person's the villain. It's just all of us in this soupy confusion of humanity working our way through these red threads. But the reason it's potent, the reason it's important, is because you bring your red threads into the birthing space. And we think as we plan to birth that what's most important is, you know, do I like my midwife? Is it a good hospital? All the technical details. Have I got the right blankets and the right equipment? The red thread element is so critical to not just your birthing outcome, but how you feel about it, whether you're coming into birthing in the center of your power or whether you're coming into birthing in a disempowered space. That you know, for me, I feel like it's such important work to do. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to pull this summit together, so that I could begin to share this work with you. Bianca's asking, is there a workbook or journaling prompts to help us work through our own red thread? Look, some of this work there's two people that have really influenced me in doing this work. One of them is Jane Hardwick Collins, who initially had been organized to come and be in this summit, but then actually she's away because it's her 30th wedding anniversary, so she wasn't available. She's a brilliant teacher and guide, and I've done a lot of red thread work with her that has been very potent. And then the other woman is Megan Waterson, who is a religious scholar. She wrote a book about Mary Magdalene, and also has done like affirmation cards and a lot of work around divine feminine. She teaches on the red thread a lot, and her work has been very influential. And then honestly, some of it is just my own work. Like this is really a body of work that I'm very deeply interested in, and starting to, who knows, it might be my next book, like starting to really explore more deeply and share with my community. I will be running a 2-day intensive training on the red thread specifically after this summit. So if you want to go into this work more deeply, I will be letting you know about the details of that training. And it's called Pathway to Birth, and it's exploring the red thread in the context of being a birth worker, being a pregnant woman. And we'll have more time. We'll go through, it's all on Zoom in a lot more detail, and look at our own stories. Let me leave you with one last story, just so that you can start to get the feel for the red thread. And I'm sharing my own stories with you, not because I think my stories are any more important than anyone else's, but just because it gives you a feel for what this work is all about. So my daughter, my 5th child, who's nearly 2 now, has always been incredibly clingy, and none of my sons were. So I have 4 boys, and they're all, you know, I did attachment parenting with all my children, so a lot of carrying them in the baby carrier, co-sleeping, breastfeeding, you know, very close. And the 4 boys were all pretty independent from pretty young, and I always attributed that to attachment parenting. It's a funny thing. People that are against attachment parenting think that you will create children that are very clingy, but it actually works the opposite way. When you really give your child a lot of love and your full presence, usually when they're ready to pull away and integrate into the world, they do so with very little anxiety because their nervous systems are wired around safety. That's a whole other conversation about attachment parenting. Anyway, so with my daughter, you know, very much the same, baby carrier, co-sleeping, you know, a lot of closeness after birth. She was immediately on the boob, breastfeeding, and I really expected a similar pathway. And this child is so clingy. She is so clingy. She just wants to be on my lap. I mean, I swear she would climb back into the womb if she could. She wants to sleep right next to me. If there is any possibility that I could do something for her instead of someone else, it always has to be me. So, you know, if my partner is there or my mother is there and they're offering to feed her dinner or give her bath or something like that, it's like, mama, 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 mama. There's a running joke in our household that, you know, she says mama a million times a day because she literally does. And I started to find it very tiresome, if I'm honest. Like, it's exhausting when a little human just wants you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and won't go to anyone else. And I was also perplexed about what I was doing that was fostering this. And so actually I went to Jane Hardwick Collins, and I spoke with her about this, and we had a bit of a red thread conversation. And, you know, as with so many of these things, when you see the answer, or when you have the insight, it seems so bloody obvious. But prior to having the insight, it's all confusing, right? So after I realized what was going on, it was like, of course, but I totally hadn't connected those dots. And this is what red thread work is all about. It's all about connecting the dots. So when I was born, I had a dislocated hip. And my hip socket was completely out of kilter. And these days they have much better technology for dealing with that. But then what had to happen was, between the age of 1 and so like 12 months and 18 months, I had to be in hospital. And I had to be in a plaster splint where literally my legs were being split open so they could put the hip socket and joint back into place and then close them back up again. So imagine this little baby, me, in hospital on her back for hours and hours and hours of every day, basically tied up, like strapped down, so that this, I mean, it was essential because otherwise I wouldn't be able to walk, so that this surgery could be done. The red thread of how my mother would have dealt with that, the trauma of watching that. I don't know if I was sedated, and I don't have living memory of it, so I can't speak about my own personal lived experience, but most likely I would have been sedated, because how do you keep a 18-month-old in a cast on a bed for 12 hours of a day? And so that happened. Okay. And then through discussing this with Jane, thinking about it more deeply, I realized, basically what I would have experienced at that time in my life is deep, deep abandonment. My mother, with the best will in the world, not through any kind of, like, she was doing the very best she could, would have gone home every night. And I would have been in the strange hospital on my own, strapped to a traction device night after night for weeks. Completely hadn't thought about it. And when Jane pointed it out to me, I was like, of course, at exactly the same time, in her own experience, my daughter, who carries that red thread experience, is like, Mama, just stay close. Just stay close. And then the cherry on top of that red thread analysis is, and Gemma's just asking, does the father have an impact? And the answer is yes, not as much, but yes. When I spoke to my partner about this red thread connection, and told him the whole story, and he's a little bit cynical, he's a tradie, he's kind of like, yeah, don't know, not sure, but he's open-minded. At some point after I told him about it, and I think he was like semi-dismissive, a couple of days later he came back to me and said, you're not going to believe it, but I've been thinking about what you said, and I remembered that when I was 1.5, I opened the front door of my home and I went out into the street and I got hit by a car, and I was in hospital for several weeks with a broken leg. And his mum, of course, remembers that story. It's part of his family narrative. Same age, in hospital, incapacitated, again, abandoned. So this abandonment wound of the red thread in my daughter is so strong. And even though nothing has happened in her life, in her lived experience, that would trigger it, the red thread teaching is so obvious to me now. And so instead of getting frustrated with her, and this is the beauty of the red thread teachings, instead of getting frustrated with her and wanting to train her out of her clinginess and, you know, no, you have to sleep in your own bed and mummy needs space and just stop climbing all over me, I really see this as an opportunity to heal little Katie, who was in that hospital bed for so long, and her father, and be as fully present and fully available to nurture and indulge her need for my closeness. It's one story, it's one of so many, that this work is so potent, and there's so many different elements to it. But I hope that through the stories I've shared with you today, you've gotten an idea of what this work is all about. And I can absolutely assure you that those red thread stories exist in your own experience. And for those of you who are birth workers, working with the red thread is so powerful in supporting women through pregnancy and through birthing and through their postnatal time, parenting. And for those of you who are pregnant, again, doing some of this work in your pregnancy will serve you so deeply as you journey towards motherhood and come into the space ready to birth your baby. And Gemma's asking, is there a way of doing the healing before it comes into fruition? The answer is yes. If you can catch it, if you can thread together the pieces of the red thread, the tapestry, and you can gain insight and clarity, enormous healing can happen before it escalates. So you don't have to take your own birthing trauma or your parents' birthing trauma or the stories around times that you were sexually violated or pain or hurt happened to you into the birthing space. It can absolutely be healed and understood and seen in a different way that facilitates totally different outcomes. Today, I've only spoken about, within this lifetime and within our own memory and lived experience. But if we want to get even more esoteric in our red thread work, we could also think about past lives and what we may or may not be bringing in from, previous incarnations that we've had in this human form. That's a whole other element that that's a whole other Pandora's box that we won't open up right now. But even just to look at pure and simple mother, grandmother, and then child, there's plenty of work in just those areas. I hope that's been interesting for you, and sown some seeds. Really, all I can try to do in this short time with the red thread teachings is sow some seeds. And as I said, I've put a training together that I'll be sharing with you very soon, that goes into this much more deeply if it's something you're interested in. We've got a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions or comments that you'd like to share on this red thread work? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or to pop them in the chat. Questions or comments? Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, red thread applies to men too, but it's mostly the matriarchal line, but yes, they are part of it because they're born from women. So they're always in the story, but the strongest red thread that you will experience in your lifetime is that of your own matriarchal line. So your father and your partners, they're relevant, but they're not the key players. Beautiful. Okay, thank you, ladies. Thank you for being present for that and for listening to my stories. And I'm really looking forward, for those of you who joined me in the training, to hearing some of your stories. We're going to take our last break of the day, and then we're going to come back and meet with beautiful Jutta, who is a midwife with 38 years of experience. She is also the home birth midwife that was present for my second birth with my second child. So I have a special connection with Jutta. And she's a beautiful, bright, shining light in the world of birthing. And I really wanted to end our day with her because she has such a strong, positive energy. So I'm looking forward to our final conversation of the day. We will meet again at 5.